weary soldier steers his truck through the blinding snow of the North Cascades, his heart heavy with the ghosts of a failed mission.
Suddenly, his headlights catch a pair of eyes that stop his breath, a German shepherd, the living image of his fallen brother's K9, being shoved into the cold by a heartless old woman. It's a broken hero, abandoned in the frost, pleading for one last chance. I'm Wilder, and this is a story about how fear turns to faith when two wounded souls find home. Where are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe to join our journey through the wild.
The sky over the North Cascades isn't just blue or gray. In the heart of winter, it becomes a suffocating shroud of white, a vast emptiness that swallows sound and hope alike.
The wind howls through the jagged peaks like a wounded predator, and the pine trees groan under the weight of an unrelenting frost. It was into this frozen purgatory that Jack Miller drove, his old Ford Raptor coughing out plumes of dark exhaust. Against the pristine snow,
Jack is a man who looks like he's been carved out of granite and then left out in the rain for too long. At 34, he has the eyes of someone twice his age, sharp, restless, and perpetually clouded by a flicker of hypervigilance. He's tall, with broad shoulders that seem perpetually hunched, as if he's still carrying a heavy rucksack through the desert sands. His face is a map of scars, both visible and hidden, framed by a rugged, unkempt beard that started to gray prematurely. He is a soldier who left the battlefield, but the battlefield never quite left him. The truck's engine backfired, a sharp metallic crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Jack's hands clamped onto the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. In an instant, the snowy pines of Washington state vanished. He was back in a dusty alley in Kandahar. The smell of diesel became the smell of burning rubber. The sound of the wind became the whistling of incoming mortar fire. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Clear, Miller! Move!" Liam's voice rang in his ears, as clear as the day the earth erupted and took the best man Jack had ever known. Liam had been the sun to Jack's moon. He was a lanky, charismatic kid from a small town with a smile that could de-escalate a riot. He was the kind of soldier who shared his last water ration and talked about his family's farm with a devotion that made Jack ache for a home he'd never really had. When Liam fell, a part of Jack stayed behind in that sand-choked alley, buried under the rubble. Now Jack was a ghost, driving a machine, heading toward Liam's hometown to deliver a small wooden box, a collection of medals and letters that felt far too light to represent a whole life. As the blizzard intensified, the Raptor's headlights struggled to pierce the gloom. That was when he saw it, a flickering neon sign for a derelict gas station, standing like a lonely lighthouse in a sea of ice. He pulled in, the tires crunching over frozen gravel. The station was a relic of a bygone era, rusted and peeling. Standing by the door was Martha. She is a woman who looks as though she was forged from bitterness and cheap cigarettes. At 60, her skin is like crumpled parchment, stretched tight over high, sharp cheekbones. She's small but deceptively sturdy, wrapped in a stained wool coat that smelled of old grease. Martha is the kind of person who sees the world as a series of transactions, and compassion isn't a currency she recognizes. Life had been hard on her, and in return, she decided to be hard on everything else. But it wasn't Martha who stopped Jack's heart. It was the shadow chained to a rusted fuel pump. At first, Jack thought it was just a pile of discarded rags. Then, the rags moved. A German shepherd, or what was left of one, struggled to stand. This wasn't the proud, muscular beast you see in movies. This dog was a skeleton wrapped in matted, dirt-clotted fur. His ribs protruded like the hull of a wrecked ship. His ears, usually alert and noble, hung heavy with ice. He was maybe 5 or 6 years old, but he carried the exhaustion of a century. Jack froze. He knew those markings. The jagged white patch on the left shoulder, the way the tip of the right ear had a tiny notch from a training accident years ago. "Shadow," Jack whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. The dog flinched. He lifted his head with agonizing slowness, and then it happened. The dog's eyes, deep, soulful amber, locked onto Jack's. In that moment, the animal didn't just look at a stranger. He saw a brother. This was Shadow, Liam's K9 partner, the dog that was supposed to have perished in the same blast that took Liam. The military report said, missing, presumed KIA. Yet here he was, chained in the middle of nowhere, a discarded tool of war. "Move along, mister," Martha barked, stepping out onto the porch with a broom in her hand. "He ain't for sale, and he ain't for pettin'. Just a mangy stray that showed up eating my chickens. I'm waiting for the county vet to come put him down. He's useless, won't bark, won't hunt, just sits there looking at nothing." Jack didn't hear her. He was walking toward the dog, ignoring the keep out signs and the woman screeching. He knelt in the freezing slush, heedless of his clean trousers. "Shadow? It's me. It's Jack," he murmured, reaching out a trembling hand. The dog didn't growl. He didn't cower. He let out a low, broken whimper, a sound that carried all the grief of the last year. He leaned his cold, wet nose into Jack's palm. The connection was electric. It was the same feeling Jack had when he held Liam's hand in those final seconds. Shadow wasn't just begging for food or warmth. He was begging to be remembered. He was recognizing the scent of the unit, the smell of the CLP oil on Jack's jacket, the cadence of a voice that belonged to a world where they both had a purpose. In that frozen wasteland, two survivors of a forgotten war had found each other. Jack looked up at Martha. His eyes were no longer clouded by PTSD. They were burning with a terrifying, focused clarity. The soldier was back. "He's not a stray," Jack said, his voice as cold as the mountain ice. "And he's sure as hell not useless. He's coming with me." Martha started to protest, waving her broom, but one look at Jack's face silenced her. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had finally found something worth fighting for. Jack reached for his wire cutters in the truck. As the metal chain snapped, the sound wasn't a backfire, it was a heartbeat. The journey to Pinecrest was no longer just about delivering a box of memories. It was about saving the only piece of Liam that was still breathing. As they climbed back into the Raptor, Shadow collapsed onto the passenger seat, his head resting on Jack's thigh. The wind continued to roar outside, but for the first time in months, the silence inside Jack's mind was peaceful. The echo in the snow had been answered. The interior of the gas station smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and the metallic tang of old machinery.
Martha didn't just move, she loomed, her small frame casting a jagged shadow against the peeling wallpaper. "I told you, soldier boy, that beast is a liability," she spat, her voice like gravel grinding in a rusty gears. "He's been taking up space for 3 weeks, eating scraps that could have gone to a good hunting dog. He's nothing but a drain on my resources, and in this weather, resources are life."
She watched Jack with narrow, suspicious eyes, her thin lips curled in a permanent sneer that suggested she had long ago traded her soul for a chance to survive the mountain's cruelty. Martha was the kind of woman who had seen the world break people, and she'd decided she'd rather be the hammer than the nail. To her, Shadow wasn't a hero. He was just a mouth she couldn't afford to feed. Jack didn't answer. He was focused on the dog. Now that he was closer, the smell hit him, the cloying, sweet scent of infection. He gently lifted Shadow's matted fur near the hind leg. A jagged, angry wound stared back at him, weeping dark fluid. It was a shrapnel injury, poorly healed and festering, likely from the same explosion that had claimed Liam. The metal had stayed inside, a jagged souvenir of a war that refused to end. Every time Shadow moved, that piece of iron bit deeper into his muscle. The dog let out a sharp, stifled whimper, his body trembling under Jack's touch. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew this wound. He'd seen it on a dozen brothers in arms. It was a slow death sentence if left untreated. "He's dying right in front of you, and you're worried about resources?" Jack's voice was a low growl, more dangerous than the storm outside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his weathered leather wallet. Inside was the last of his savings, $300 he'd set aside for a new start after delivering Liam's things. It was everything he had. He slapped the bills onto the grease-stained counter. "Take it. All of it. He's mine now." Martha's eyes flickered toward the money, her greed momentarily eclipsing her malice. She snatched the bills with a claw-like hand, disappearing them into her apron without a word of thanks. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, admitting a swirl of snow and a woman who looked like a bird of prey made of starlight. This was Clara. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet, steely grace that commanded attention even in a room full of ghosts. She was a volunteer nurse from the valley, her face pale and sharp-featured, framed by dark hair pulled back into a practical, severe bun. Her eyes were a piercing, intelligent blue, the kind of eyes that could spot a lie or a fever from across a field. Clara was a woman who lived by logic and sterile gauze. She had seen enough trauma in the rural clinics to know that hope was often a dangerous luxury. She wore a heavy, utilitarian parka that looked 2 sizes too big for her slight frame, and her hands, though gloved, moved with a restless, clinical precision. Clara walked straight to where Jack was kneeling, her boots clumping heavily on the wooden floor. She looked at the dog, then at Jack's trembling hands, and finally at the blood-stained bandage Jack was trying to improvise. "You're out of your mind if you think you can take him over the pass in this," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "That leg is septic. He needs a surgical suite, not the back of a Ford Raptor. And you've got the 1,000-yard stare of a man who hasn't slept since the Bush administration. You're gonna get yourself killed, and you'll take that poor animal down with you." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Jack looked up at her, his eyes hard. "I'm not leaving him here to be shot by a woman who counts pennies while he bleeds." Clara sighed, a sound of profound exasperation. "I'm not saying leave him. I'm saying be realistic. The North Pass is closing. If you get stuck in a drift, he'll freeze in an hour. He can't regulate his body temperature with an infection like that." She stepped closer, examining the wound with a professional's detachment, though a flicker of pity softened her gaze for a split second. "I have some antibiotics and basic sutures in my kit, but it's a patch job at best. You're an amateur playing at being a savior, Miller. I've seen men like you before, all heart and no head. It usually ends in a funeral." Jack ignored her skepticism. He stood up, walked to his truck, and pulled out his old olive-drab army field jacket. It was worn thin at the elbows, smelling of gun oil, tobacco, and a faint lingering scent of the desert. He returned to Shadow and carefully draped the heavy fabric over the dog's shivering frame. The moment the wool touched him, something changed in Shadow. The dog's frantic breathing slowed. He buried his muzzle into the collar of the jacket, inhaling deeply. It was the smell of his pack. It was the smell of the barracks, of long nights on watch, of the only men who had ever treated him like a partner instead of a tool. For the first time in months, Shadow stopped shaking. He looked up at Jack, a faint glimmer of recognition, of trust, returning to his tired eyes. Clara watched this, her arms crossed, her skeptical mask slipping just enough to show she was impressed despite herself. "Fine," she muttered, grabbing her medical bag. "I'll help you stabilize him for the drive. But don't mistake my help for approval. You're still a fool, Jack Miller, but at least you're a fool with a decent jacket." As the wind roared outside, threatening to tear the roof off the station, Jack hoisted the heavy dog into his arms. Shadow was lighter than he should have been, a ghost of a warrior. Martha watched them from behind her counter, a silent vulture waiting for the inevitable crash. But as Jack stepped back out into the whiteout, Shadow's head resting against his chest, the cold front didn't feel quite so biting anymore. They were moving. They were surviving, and for a soldier who had lost everything, that was enough. The world ended in a roar of white.
The avalanche had struck just as Jack steered the Raptor toward a hunter's bypass, a wall of snow and splintered pine trees cascading down the slope, burying the road and pinning the truck against the side of an old, abandoned ranger cabin.
The silence that followed was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that made the small cabin feel like a tomb. Inside, the air was frigid, the only light coming from a flickering kerosene lantern Jack had found on a dusty shelf. The cabin was a skeletal structure of cedar and stone, smelling of dry rot and ancient pine needles. It was a space designed for survival, not comfort. And right now, it was the only thing keeping the frost from claiming them both. Jack knelt on the uneven floorboards, his breath blooming in pale clouds. Shadow lay before him, sprawled across the army jacket, his breathing shallow and jagged. The infection in his leg had taken a turn for the worse. The heat radiating from the wound was palpable even through the chill. Jack knew that, without intervention, the dog wouldn't see the sunrise. He opened his tactical medical kit, the metal instruments glinting coldly under the amber lantern light. His hands, usually steady enough to calibrate a long-range scope, were trembling. The trauma of the crash and the lack of sleep were catching up to him, pulling him back into the gray fog of his own mind. "Easy, boy," Jack whispered, though his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. He had to be the medic now. He had to be the one who didn't break. He began the grim work of debriding the wound, his fingers slick with antiseptic and dark blood. Shadow flinched, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest, his teeth bared in a primal reflex of pain. This was a dog who had been betrayed by humans for months, a warrior who had forgotten what a kind hand felt like. But Jack didn't pull away. He spoke in a low, rhythmic cadence, the way he used to talk to Liam during the long, silent desert watches. He told Shadow about the rain in Washington, about the taste of a real steak, about the home they were going to find. Slowly, the snarl faded into a pained whimper. The dog's amber eyes remained locked on Jack, searching for a reason to trust the man with the needle. As the hours dragged on, the cold seeped into Jack's bones, and exhaustion finally dragged him under. He drifted into a feverish sleep, slumped against the cabin wall. In his dreams, the snow turned to sand. He saw Liam standing in the shimmering heat of the Helmand province, wearing that lopsided grin that always made the war feel smaller. Liam looked healthy, his uniform clean, his eyes bright with that irrepressible Iowa farm boy energy. "You gotta keep him moving, Miller," Liam said, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a well. "He's the last of us. Don't let the fire go out." Jack reached out, but Liam dissolved into a cloud of dust, the sound of an explosion shattering the dreamlike glass. Jack jerked awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The lantern was dying, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. He looked down and saw Shadow watching him. The dog hadn't moved, but something in his posture had shifted. Jack reached for a tin of canned beef he had opened earlier. He took a small piece and held it out in his palm. Shadow hesitated, his nose twitching, the instinct to flee battling the desperate ache of hunger. For a long minute, neither moved. Then, with agonizing slowness, Shadow stretched his neck and took the meat from Jack's hand. The contact was brief, but it was a bridge. He ate another piece, then another, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the wooden floor. He was no longer just a stray or a victim, he was a partner again. While checking the dog's comfort, Jack noticed something thick and metallic caught in the matted fur of Shadow's heavy nylon collar. He reached in, his fingers brushing against a cold, flat surface. He unbuckled the collar and found a second hidden compartment sewn into the lining. Sliding it out, he felt a jolt of electricity run through his spine. It was a dog tag. Not Shadow's, but a human one. The notched stainless steel was scorched around the edges, but the letters were unmistakable. Liam Patrick Callahan, U.S. Army. Liam had hidden his spare tag on Shadow, a final act of insurance, perhaps knowing that if they were ever separated, the dog would carry his identity home. Seeing the name in the dim light brought a fresh wave of grief, but also a fierce, burning clarity. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore, it was a homecoming. The night deepened and the storm outside intensified, the wind shaking the cabin's timber frame until it groaned. Jack couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the sound of the wind became the scream of a jet engine or the crack of a sniper's rifle. He sat with his back to the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his mind a battlefield. But then he felt a weight. Shadow had dragged himself across the floor, his injured leg trailing behind him, until he reached Jack's side. The dog rested his heavy, wedge-shaped head directly onto Jack's knee. The vibration of Shadow's breathing, deep, steady, and rhythmic, began to drown out the phantom sounds of war. It was a grounding force, a living pulse that tethered Jack to the present. As the dog's warmth seeped through Jack's trousers, the tension in his shoulders finally began to dissolve. The nightmares of gunfire were replaced by the simple, honest reality of a heartbeat. In that dark, frozen cabin, surrounded by fragments of a home they had both lost, the soldier and the hound found the only thing that could truly heal them, each other. The third night in the buried cabin brought a cold that felt personal, a biting frost that seeped through the timber gaps like a phantom.
Outside, the world was a silent, white void, but inside, the air was charged with a primitive tension. Jack was stoking the dying embers of the hearth when he heard it, not the wind, but a heavy, rhythmic scratching against the exterior logs.
Shadow's ears, previously flat against his head, suddenly snapped upright. A low, vibrating rumble started deep in the dog's chest. A sound more tectonic than animal. Jack froze, his hand hovering over the woodpile. He knew that sound. It was the presence of a predator that didn't care about metals or scars. A massive grizzly, driven to desperation by the early deep freeze and the scent of blood from Shadow's wound, was testing the strength of their sanctuary. The heavy cedar door groaned under a sudden, violent impact. The iron bolt shuddered. Jack lunged for his tactical rifle leaning against the far wall, but as he moved, his boot slipped on a patch of black ice formed by the leaking roof. He fell hard, his shoulder slamming into the edge of a heavy oak table. A sharp, sickening pop echoed in the small space, and white-hot pain exploded down his right arm. He reached out with his left hand, but the rifle was inches beyond his grasp, and his dominant hand hung useless at his side, the nerves screaming in protest. The door splintered. A massive silver-tipped claw forced its way through the gap, followed by the terrifying hot musk of a beast that weighed 800 pounds. In that moment of vulnerability, something extraordinary happened. Shadow, who had spent the last 2 days barely able to stand, rose. He didn't rise like a wounded animal. He rose like a soldier answering a bugle call. Despite the septic fever still burning in his veins and the jagged stitches in his leg, the dog's posture transformed. His hackles stood like a ridge of black obsidian. The submissive tilt of his head vanished, replaced by a lethal, focused intensity. Shadow stepped over Jack's fallen body, positioning himself directly between the splintering door and his brother in arms. He wasn't barking. He was emitting a continuous bone-chilling snarl that resonated with the authority of a K9 who had faced down insurgents in the dark of night. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the swirling snow from the broken window. "Jack, are you in there?" It was Clara. She had ignored her own warnings and followed the raptor's tracks before the trail vanished, arriving in her battered Jeep. She had climbed through the snowdrifts to find them, but now she was trapped on the porch, frozen in terror as the grizzly turned its massive head toward her. She was a woman of science, but standing 3 feet away from a mountain of fur and teeth, she looked small and fragile. Her medical bag dropped into the snow, her breath coming in frantic silver gasps. "Clara! Get back!" Jack shouted, struggling to pull himself up with one arm. But the bear was already pivoting, its predatory focus shifting to the easier prey on the porch. That was when Shadow moved. He didn't lung for the throat in a suicidal charge. Instead, he executed a flawless diversionary maneuver. He leaped toward the bear's flank, snapping at the air inches from its sensitive nose, then instantly retreated, circling back into the shadows of the cabin. It was a tactical dance. Every time the grizzly tried to commit to an attack on the door, or Clara, Shadow was there, a black blur of teeth and fury, drawing the beast's attention away. Clara watched from the porch, her back against the logs, witnessing a scene that defied her clinical understanding of animal behavior. She saw the silent communication between the man and the dog. Jack, despite his dislocated shoulder, began throwing heavy pieces of firewood toward the bear's left side, funneling the predator into the path Shadow was creating. There were no commands yelled, no whistles blown. It was the silent, synchronized combat rhythm of two souls who had survived the same fire. Shadow used the grizzly's own weight against it, nipping at its heels and darting away before the massive paws could crush him. He was playing a game of psychological warfare, making the bear believe it was being surrounded by a pack rather than a single crippled dog. Frustrated and confused by this ghost that refused to be caught, the grizzly let out a final, earth-shaking roar and swiped one last time at the cabin door, leaving deep gouges in the wood. But the predatory math no longer added up. The prey was too loud, too coordinated, and too fierce. With a huff of icy breath, the bear retreated into the whiteout, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. The silence that returned was thick and heavy. Clara slumped against the doorframe, her heart racing. She looked at Shadow, who was now standing perfectly still, his chest heaving, his eyes still fixed on the darkness. Clara stepped into the cabin, her hands trembling as she approached Jack, but her eyes never left the dog. "I've seen animals protect their owners," she whispered, her voice filled with a new, profound respect. "But that wasn't just protection. That was a calculated defense. He didn't fight like a dog. He fought like he was back in the service." She knelt beside Jack, her professional mask finally crumbling to reveal the awe underneath. She saw how Shadow finally relaxed, limping back to Jack and resting his chin on the soldier's good shoulder. The tension in the room broke, not with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic sound of a dog's tail thumping against the floorboards. The instinct had been reborn, but it wasn't the instinct to kill. It was the instinct to hold the line for the ones you love. The storm finally broke, leaving behind a world draped in a deceptive, sparkling silence.
The Ford Raptor, now scarred by ice and forest debris, rolled slowly into the quiet town of Pinecrest. It was the kind of American town that felt like a postcard from a simpler time. White picket fences, a small church with a weathered steeple, and the smell of wood smoke hanging heavy in the crisp morning air.
Jack drove with a hollow feeling in his chest, his dislocated shoulder bound tightly in a sling Clara had fashioned before they parted ways at the trailhead. Beside him, Shadow sat tall, his gaze fixed on the passing familiar landmarks, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant school bus. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of their destination. The air between them was thick with an unvoiced apprehension. They pulled up in front of a modest, 2-story farmhouse at the end of a long driveway lined with dormant apple trees. This was the Callahan residence. Standing on the porch was Thomas Callahan, Liam's father. At 65, Thomas was a man built like an old oak, sturdy, weathered, and deeply rooted. He wore a faded flannel shirt and denim overalls, his face a rugged landscape of hard work and honest living. His eyes, the same piercing blue as Liam's, were clouded with a grief that had aged him a decade in a single year. Beside him was Sarah Callahan, a woman whose grace seemed to defy the weight of her sorrow. She was slender and silver-haired, with a gentle oval face that bore the faint traces of 1,000 smiles, now silenced. Sarah had always been the heart of the community, the woman who baked pies for every funeral. But since the news of Liam's death, she had become a ghost in her own home, her vibrant spirit dimmed by an unbearable loss. As Jack stepped out of the truck, the silence was agonizing. Thomas and Sarah froze, their breath hitching at the sight of the man who had come home while their son had not. The pain on their faces was a physical blow to Jack. But before a word could be spoken, Shadow leaped from the passenger seat. He didn't bark. He let out a long, keening cry that sounded like a human sob. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She recognized the dog instantly, the missing K9 from the unit's reports. The creature her son had described in every letter as his four-legged shadow. In an instant, the stoic reserve of the Callahans shattered. They didn't see a stray animal. They saw a piece of Liam's soul returned from the grave. Sarah collapsed to her knees in the snow, burying her face in Shadow's thick fur, while Thomas laid a trembling hand on the dog's head, his shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. Inside the warmth of the living room, surrounded by photographs of a smiling Liam in various stages of his life, the real battle began. Jack sat by the fireplace, the light of the flames dancing in his haunted eyes. The wooden box of Liam's medals sat on the coffee table, a heavy, silent witness. "It should have been me," Jack whispered, his voice breaking for the first time. The words poured out like a flood. The guilt of the ambush, the chaos of the sand, the way he had survived while the best man he knew had vanished into the fire. He told them how he had blamed himself every second of every day, how he felt like a thief for still drawing breath. He looked at the floor, unable to meet their gaze, waiting for the judgment he felt he deserved. Shadow, sensing the darkness closing in on Jack, refused to remain a passive observer. The dog began a restless, purposeful patrol of the room. He moved from Sarah to Thomas, leaning his weight against their legs, offering the silent comfort of his presence. Then, he trotted toward the back door, scratching at the wood until Thomas opened it. A few minutes later, Shadow returned from the snow-covered backyard. In his mouth was a tattered, faded blue frisbee, an old toy Liam had used to play with him during their brief visits home before deployment. The dog walked straight to Jack and dropped the frozen toy directly onto his boots. He looked up at Jack with a clarity that felt supernatural, a steady, unwavering gaze that seemed to say, "I am here. He sent me to bring you back, not just to bring me home." Thomas walked over and placed a heavy, calloused hand on Jack's good shoulder. "Jack, look at us," he said, his voice thick but firm. "We didn't lose a son just to lose another one to guilt. Do you think Liam would want you to live in that dark place? Look at that dog. He didn't give up. He waited in the cold until you found him. He didn't come back for us. He came back for you." Sarah joined them, taking Jack's hand in hers. "Shadow isn't just a dog to us, Jack. He's the living proof that love doesn't end when a heart stops. He's the guardian Liam sent to make sure you didn't get lost in the storm. It's time to stop fighting the war, son. It's time to come home." In that moment, the crushing weight of the failed mission began to lift. Shadow let out a soft huff and curled up at Jack's feet, his head resting on the soldier's boots right next to the old blue frisbee. The reunion at Pinecrest wasn't just about a dog finding his family. It was about a soldier finding his permission to survive. As the sun began to set over the Cascades, painting the snow in hues of gold and violet, Jack Miller finally took a breath that didn't hurt. The message was clear. The time for penance was over. The time for healing had begun. The spring in Pinecrest arrived, not with a roar, but with the gentle drip of melting ice and the smell of damp earth rising to meet the sun.
The valley, once a white prison of silence, began to breathe again, its meadows turning a vibrant emerald green. For Jack Miller, this spring was different from any he had known for the first time in his life. He wasn't looking for a way out or a place to hide. He was building a place to stay.
He had traded his tactical gear for flannel shirts and work boots, and the haunted hollowness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He decided to use the small inheritance from his family and the support of the Callahans to purchase a derelict ranch on the outskirts of town, right at the base of the mountains that had nearly claimed his life. This ranch became the Cascade Guardian Center. It wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary. Jack and Shadow began a mission to train search and rescue dogs specifically for the treacherous terrain of the Northwest. Shadow, now fully healed, though carrying a noble scar on his hind leg, became the undisputed captain of the pack. He wasn't just a dog being trained, he was the teacher. Shadow possessed an uncanny ability to sense the fear in younger dogs and the hidden dangers in the snow. He led the drills with a military precision that left the locals in awe. Watching him work was like watching a master conductor leading an orchestra of barks and movement. Shadow had found his purpose again, no longer a ghost of the past, but a guardian of the future. Among the new faces at the ranch was Benny, a 19-year-old local boy with a shock of red hair and a stutter that made him shy away from people. Benny was thin and energetic, always wearing an oversized trucker hat and a lopsided grin. He had grown up feeling broken by the world's standards, but around the dogs, he was a natural. Jack saw a reflection of a younger, unburdened Liam in Benny's kindness. Jack took the boy under his wing, teaching him not just how to handle the animals, but how to lead with confidence. Through Benny, Jack realized that his trauma hadn't just given him scars, it had given him the empathy to recognize the potential in others who felt lost. The relationship between Jack and Clara also blossomed like the wildflowers on the slopes. Clara had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, initially coming to check on Shadow's leg, but eventually staying for the long walks in the woods and the quiet dinners on the porch. She was still the same sharp-witted, logical woman, but the ice around her heart had melted. She had seen Jack transform from a man running from death into a man cultivating life, and it had changed her too. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Clara leaned her head against Jack's shoulder. "I told you that you were a fool, Jack Miller," she whispered, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I'm glad you didn't listen to me." As the center grew, so did Jack's peace. He no longer woke up clutching his knife or gasping for air in the dark. Instead, he woke to the sound of Shadow's tail thumping against the floorboards and the scent of pine needles. He realized that he hadn't failed his mission in the desert. He had simply been redirected to a new one. Every hiker they found in the woods, every lost child brought back to their parents by a dog Shadow had trained was a tribute to Liam. The guilt had been forged into a shield, used to protect the community that had adopted him. On a crisp, clear afternoon that marked the one-year anniversary of their arrival, Jack whistled for Shadow. Together, they hiked up to the highest ridge overlooking the Pinecrest Valley. The view was breathtaking, a patchwork of green forests, silver rivers, and the quiet, peaceful town nestled in the heart of it all. The air was thin and sweet, the wind no longer a predator, but a companion. Jack knelt in the soft grass and pulled Shadow close. The dog leaned into him, his amber eyes reflecting the vast open sky. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his own set of dog tags, the silver metal gleaming in the sunlight. With steady hands, he unlatched Shadow's collar. Beside the scorched tag of Liam Callahan, Jack carefully threaded his own tag. The metallic clink as the two pieces of steel touched was the final chord in a long, painful symphony. Two soldiers, one human and one K9, both of whom had been discarded by the world, were now officially home. "We did it, Shadow," Jack murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it back." Shadow let out a short, sharp bark of agreement, his gaze fixed on the valley below. They stood there for a long time, the man and his dog, two guardians of the Cascades. They were no longer defined by the war they had left behind, but by the lives they were saving today. As the first stars began to twinkle over the peaks, they turned and started the trek back down toward the lights of the ranch, where Clara, the Callahans, and a new life were waiting for them. The mission was complete, and for the first time in his life, Jack Miller knew exactly where he belonged.
This is Wilder again. As the fire dies down and the stars take over the sky, I want to leave you with a final thought from the mountains.
Jack and Shadow found their way home, not because the path was easy, but because they refused to let go of each other. In our own lives, we all face storms that threaten to blow us off course. We all carry scars that no one else can see, and sometimes the world feels as cold as a Cascades blizzard. But remember this. We often think we are the ones doing the rescuing, whether it is a dog in the snow or a friend in need. In reality, it is usually the ones we help who end up saving our souls. They give us a reason to keep moving when our own strength fails.
If you are walking through a dark valley right now, do not lose heart. Your new mission is just around the corner. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might be feeling lost today. Your kindness could be the compass that leads them home. Tell me about the loyal companions in your life in the comments, and subscribe to our channel to join us for more stories from the wild. May God watch over you, protect your family, and keep your spirit strong on every trail you walk. If you believe that love and loyalty can heal even the deepest wounds, please type Amen in the comments below. God bless you all, and I will see you on the next journey.